A true story from the Seacliff coast. My stepfather, Silas, abused me every day. "You're naught but a frightened little wisp, girl. No one will heed your tales," he'd declare each dawn. It wasn't a hushed warning, nor an idle threat. It was a vow, uttered with the same certainty a mariner uses when he consults his barometer. Before I share this special story with you, could I ask for a little favor? A like on this video and subscribing to our channel makes such a difference. It also signals to YouTube that you appreciate these kinds of uplifting narratives, so they can recommend more wonderful stories like this one for you to enjoy. Silas was resolute, and for many years, I believed him. My name is Alara. I was born in a windswept hamlet on the Seacliff coast, where the sea spray etched the cliffs and secrets were caught in the mournful cry of the gulls. I lived with my mother, Agnes, in a small clapboard cottage that once smelled of baking soda bread. I say once, because when Silas anchored himself in our lives, everything altered. I was 8 years old when he married my mother. I recall her simple woolen dress. It was borrowed and a size too large. She gazed at him as if he were her last safe harbor. He didn't return her smile, merely inclined his head, like a merchant finalizing a grim bargain. That was the first time I felt it, a shiver despite the August sun. I didn't call him Da at first. It was Mr. Silas, then just Silas. In time, I called him nothing, for silence felt the safer course. The initial weeks were calm. He was formal in public, almost unnervingly so. Folk would murmur, "Agnes has finally found a steady hand, a good provider." He worked as the lighthouse keeper and wore a starched collar on Sundays. But within our walls, he had his decrees. My hair had to be in tight braids, my boots placed just so by the door, my voice a mere whisper. And then he began, bolting my door. I remember the evening my mother had gone for her shift at the fish cannery. I was sketching seabirds on a piece of driftwood with a charcoal nub when he entered my room without a wrap. "It's late," he said, his voice like the grinding of stones. "Girls who bide awake too long, they ripen too quick." He pulled back the rough-spun blanket on my cot. I paused. He loomed closer. "In," he commanded. I obeyed. Then he departed, and I heard the heavy bolt slide home. Thunk. I scrambled to the door. It was fast. I pounded. I wept. Nothing. He unbolted it at 6 the following morning. No good morning, just a hard look, and the words, "You're naught but a frightened little wisp, girl. No one will heed your tales." That became the cadence of my girlhood. At first I imagined him merely stern. Then I knew he was perilous. He didn't strike me, not then. He didn't need to. The bolting, the ceaseless watching, the way he'd stand too near when I washed my face at the basin, it was sufficient. I tried to tell my mum one morning. I followed her into the small kitchen. She was stirring porridge. "Mum," I ventured, "Silas bolted my door last night. I couldn't get out." She didn't turn. "He's just trying to keep you from harm," she said. "From what?" She faced me then, her eyes shadowed with weariness. "From yourself." I opened my mouth to protest, but she slammed the wooden spoon onto the counter. "Don't you dare answer back. That man puts fish on our table. Be thankful." I learned that day my mother craved calm, not truth, and I was the toll. Silas grew more audacious after that. He'd tug my braids sharply if I spoke out of turn, slam a cupboard door if I forgot my thank you. Once, I spilled a cup of water on the scoured wooden floor. He seized my wrist, his grip so fierce it left a dark bloom. When I showed my mother, she said I bruised like a ripe plum. "You're too sensitive," she declared. I ceased telling her things. But the bleakest night arrived when I was 9. It was Chapel Sunday. I wore a drab gray wool dress, a hand-me-down from a cousin. Silas deemed it too short. After we returned, He summoned me to the main room. "You think you can parade about looking like that?" he snarled. "It's just a dress." Before I could finish, his hand cracked against my cheek. I staggered, struck the old sea chest, and crumpled. My ears hummed. I looked up and saw my mother standing in the doorway. She'd witnessed it all. I waited, praying for her to rail, to weep, to rush to me. She did none of these. Instead, she strode over, hauled me up by the arm, and hissed, "Apologize to him." I couldn't form words. "Do it!" she snapped. "I'm sorry," I whispered. Silas folded his arms. "She'll learn." That night, he bolted my door again. The next morning, the same ritual, the same pronouncement. "You're not but a frightened little wisp, girl. No one will heed your tales." I stopped being a child that day. I began counting things instead. The seconds it took him to walk down the narrow passage. The minutes my mother spent gazing out to sea when she should have been seeing me. The number of bruises I could conceal beneath long sleeves. I remember thinking that if I could just count high enough, perhaps one day it would cease. But it didn't. Not for 60 years. People believe abuse is all broken bones and blackened eyes, but the most insidious kind, the sort that settles in your marrow, is quieter. Silas rarely hit me. He had no need. He constructed a prison of rules and shame and glares that proclaimed my worthlessness long before he ever raised his hand. By the time I was 10, he dictated what I wore, what I ate, when I was permitted to speak. My mother called it guidance. I called it a cage. He selected my clothes each morning. Long skirts, shapeless jerseys, anything to hide my form. "Girls with womanly shapes invite trouble," he'd say. Trouble on his tongue meaning me. I wasn't allowed a morsel of food unless he offered it. My meager earnings from selling gathered dulse came in small coins I had to count before him, every penny justified. And friends? He disliked girls who laughed too freely or wore ribbons in their hair. One by one, my schoolmates stopped asking me to play by the shore. I couldn't explain. What could I say? My stepfather inspects my breath when I return to see if I've been chattering too much. I kept my lips sealed. But Miss Ainsworth, my teacher in the one-room schoolhouse, noticed. She had kind eyes, a gentle voice, and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes. One afternoon, she asked me to stay after lessons. "You've been very quiet lately, Alara," she said. "Is everything all right?" I nodded too hastily. She frowned. "You flinched when young Thomas tapped your shoulder today." I looked down at my hands, the nails rimmed with grime. I picked at a loose thread on my skirt. "I just don't care for surprises, ma'am," I mumbled. "Sweet child," she said softly. "You can speak to me about anything." Something within me fractured. I hadn't heard such tenderness in years, so I told her, not everything, just enough. The bolted door, the silence, the bruises that bloomed and faded. She was silent for a moment, then said, "That's not right, Alara. None of it." I left the schoolhouse feeling lighter than I had in an age. 2 days later, she was gone. "Family matter, far away," the postmistress said. But I knew better. Silas came home that night, his eyes like chips of flint. "Did you think she wouldn't tell the harbor master's wife?" he boomed. "You think you're so clever?" He didn't strike me that night. He didn't need to. He stared at me, long and hard, until I wished he would. The next morning, the bolt on my door was reinforced with a second, heavier one. My mother didn't ask why. By then she was more shadow than woman, drifting through the cottage like a specter, always tired, always taut. I stopped calling her Mum, not aloud, not even in my head. She had become her. Her eyes followed Silas as if she needed his leave to draw breath. I once asked her why she never smiled anymore. She said, "I smile when you behave yourself." I learned to stop asking. Still, something inside me yearned for release, not escape. Just a breath of air, a whisper of it. I began writing late at night, under my thin blanket, by the dim light of a smuggled candle stub. I wrote verses, journal entries, desperate pleas. I wrote letters, some to God, some to no one. And then I wrote a real letter, to the regional magistrate. I named no names, just described what was happening. A man is locking up his stepdaughter. He controls everything. She is afraid. I hid it in the back of an old nautical almanac. A week later, my mother found it. I came home from school to see her sitting at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her like a gutted fish. She said, nothing at first, just tapped her fingernail on the paper. "Where were you planning to send this?" she finally asked. I didn't answer. She stood, walked over, and slapped me, so hard my cheek throbbed with fire. "Do you know what this would do? To us?" I touched my face. "To him!" she cried. I looked up. "What about what he's done to me?" She froze. Then she snatched up the letter, tore it in half, then again and again, until it was confetti on the floor. "If you ever try anything like this again," she said, her voice like ice, "don't come crying to me. Don't come calling me anything." She left the pieces there for me to clear. That night, I went to my small room and didn't weep. I didn't rage. I just stared at the low ceiling and mouthed the words, "I believe me." It became a ritual. Every time Silas called me not, every time my mother called me ungrateful, I whispered, "I believe me." I said it under my breath when I scrubbed the floors. I said it when I stirred the chowder. I said it when I mended his heavy work socks, staring at the garments of the man who was breaking me in ways that left no visible scars. I believe me. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And it kept me going until I could make someone else believe. Me too. I was 17 when I ran. By then my world had shrunk to the four corners of that cottage. Silas's rules were maritime law. My mother was his echo. And I had become a ghost in my own skin. But ghosts can still slip through cracks. It was a Tuesday, the kind of day that smelled of damp wool and distant fish gutting. I had $12 saved, coins earned from selling berries, folded small and hidden in an old tobacco tin beneath my mattress. I left just after 2 p.m., when I knew Silas would be at the lighthouse and my mother would be resting, her back to the door. I took an oilskin satchel with 2 shifts, a toothbrush, and the money. I walked, then I ran, then I hitched a ride on a logging truck whose driver didn't ask too many questions. By nightfall, I was in Bridgetown, the nearest large port. It was noisier than I expected. Lights everywhere, lorries that didn't stop for pedestrians, people who looked right through you even when you stared straight at them. I found a seaman's mission 3 streets from the bus depot. They gave me soup, a narrow bunk, and a woven cord bracelet with my name on it. It felt like a tag from the summer fair, except this one said I belonged somewhere safe. I stayed for 4 days. On the 5th morning, 2 constables appeared. "Lara Vance?" one of them asked. I nodded. "Your stepfather reported you missing. Says you're a minor. I'll be 18 in 6 months," I said. The other constable shook his head. "That's not how the law sees it, miss." They drove me back in the rear of their car. I didn't cry. I just watched the coastline blur by and wondered if I'd ever see the town again without restraints. Silas was waiting on the stoop when we pulled up. "Thank God," he said, shaking the constable's hands like a grieving patriarch from a play. "We were so worried." He even feigned a tear. I didn't utter a word. The constables left. My mother hugged me once, quickly, like ticking off a chore. Then Silas said, "Get in the house." I did, but I didn't go to my room. He grabbed me by the arm and yanked me toward the cellar door. "You think you're grown now, eh?" he hissed. The door groaned open. Chill, damp air rose to meet us. "You don't get to walk away from this family," he said. Then he shoved me down the rickety stairs. I caught myself on the splintered railing, bare. The door slammed shut. The bolt slid home. I heard his heavy boots thud overhead, and then silence. There was no window, no light, just cobwebs and packed earth, and the smell of mildew. The first few hours, I tried to remain calm. I counted heartbeats, breathed in 4s, did everything the mission sister told me to do when fear took hold. But night came, and with it, the thirst. No water, no food, just echoes. My stomach rumbled so loudly, I thought the rats would come investigating. I pulled an old fishing net from a broken crate and wrapped it around myself. On the second day, I screamed. Not words, just sound, raw, animalistic. It bounced off the damp stone walls and returned, diminished, and I realized no one was listening. That was the moment I stopped waiting. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a sharp shard of a seashell I'd found earlier. No ink, just jagged nacre. I walked to a piece of broken mirror propped against the wall. It was grimy, cracked, and old, like me, and I began cutting. Not my skin, my hair, one handful at a time. Snip, snip. Each cut was a scream I couldn't voice. Each strand that fell to the earthen floor was a piece of the girl he thought he owned. I hacked at it until it was jagged and uneven, sticking up like storm-tossed dune grass. It wasn't comely, but it was mine. The third day, he opened the door. "Ready to apologize," he said, his voice smug. I stood up, holding a clump of my shorn hair like a defiant banner. He stared at me. "What in blazes did you do?" "I cut it," I said, "so you can't touch it." His jaw twitched. He reached for me and I flinched, but he didn't strike me. Not that time. He just backed away. "You'll regret that," he muttered. Maybe, but for once, it was my choice. He let me wash, but not alone. He stood outside the washroom door, counting to ensure I didn't tarry. My mother said nothing, didn't ask where I'd been. She just handed me a bone-handled brush and walked away. That night, I looked in the cracked mirror. My hair was a ruin, my face pale, but in my eyes, something new had sparked. I had left once. I could leave again. And next time, I wouldn't. Come back. I'm 78 now. I live alone in a small cottage at the edge of Stillwater Cove, a quiet village farther up the coast. Yes, that's really its name. Some days it feels like this whole shoreline is built on both stillness and consequence. I don't have family. Not anymore. My mother passed years ago. We hadn't spoken since I was 23. Silas lived longer, though. I never visited. The last I heard, he'd moved to a desolate spit of land near Whaler's End. Still sharp-tongued, still walking. He always was too mean to die early. I've never married, never had children. Not because I didn't wish to. I just never found someone I trusted enough to build a life with. The kind of silence Silas cultivated doesn't just stay in your home. It follows you, like sea mist in your hair, even after the storm has passed. But I kept living. I worked at the local general store until I retired. Read books borrowed from the mobile library, grew herbs in a window box. I smiled at strangers, chuckled at old radio comedies. I made it through life quietly, like a half-forgotten sea shanty, until one Tuesday afternoon when I decided to speak. It started with a notice pinned to the post office board. Women's Circle, Thursdays at 3 p.m. for those who have carried too much for too long. I stared at it for a full minute, then took it home. The following Thursday, I put on my best knitted cardigan, tidied my hair, and walked the 6 blocks to the parish hall. The room was small, warm, filled with folding chairs and kind faces. Most were younger than me, but one woman looked even older. No one asked why I was there. We went around the circle, one by one. Some spoke of recent heartaches, others of children they'd lost touch with. And then it was my turn. I hesitated. "My name is Alara," I said. The room waited. And then I told them. Not everything, but enough. I told them about the door, the bolts, the words Silas repeated every morning. I told them how my mother called me a liar, how silence became my second skin, how I never really got free. When I finished, no one clapped, no one gasped. They were just quiet. It was the kindest silence I'd ever known. Then a voice from the back of the room broke it. "I know that name," a man said. Everyone turned. He stood up slowly, gripping the back of the chair in front of him. I knew a Silas Blackwood, kept the North Point light, attended St. Brendan's Chapel every Sunday, drove an old green pickup. "That him?" I nodded. He exhaled, a long, heavy sound. "I was the harbor master for Carrick Port for 22 years, he said. "Retired now. But back then, I remember hearing whispers, rumors about him. But no one ever talked, no one ever reported." He looked at me, straight in the eyes. "I'm sorry," he said. "You shouldn't have carried this alone." My throat tightened. I hadn't cried in years, but something in his voice, steady, not pitying, broke through. He didn't look at me like a victim. He looked at me like a witness, a woman who survived. His name was Arthur. I found that out the next day when he showed up at my doorstep with a weathered ledger tucked under one arm and a paper bag of oatcakes in the other. "Figured you might need something solid to go with something bitter," he said with a gentle smile. I let him in. I wasn't used to visitors, certainly not ones who remembered my name after one conversation. He sat at my small kitchen table like he'd been there 100 times. No staring, no questions about my old cottage or why the curtains were often drawn. Just that ledger, resting like a sleeping cat between us. "Went digging last night," he said. "Old habit, I guess. Couldn't sleep." He opened the ledger. Inside were notes, jottings, names I hadn't seen in decades. "This is from 57, he said. We had a string of anonymous mentions. Girls between 12 and 16. Nothing ever stuck. No witnesses, no names. Just fear." He looked at me, then added, "I think they were trying to talk about him. Your stepfather." My hands trembled slightly as I picked up a loose sheet. The handwriting was slanted, rushed, descriptions vague, like someone had tried to scream through a whisper. "Back then," Arthur continued, "if a girl didn't name names, we filed it away and moved on. It was wrong. I knew it was wrong. But regulations are regulations, until someone breaks them." He tapped the ledger. "This is you breaking them." I didn't know what to say, so I did what I always did when silence made me nervous. I offered tea. He smiled again. 2 sugars, a touch of milk. We talked for hours that day. Not just about Silas, about the village, about the years we'd both lost in different ways, about faith and trust, and what it means to believe someone even when it costs you comfort. Before he left, he said, "I'm not letting this die in a dusty file. You opened a door, Alara. Let's walk through it." 2 weeks later, he came back with more than a ledger. He came with names, 3 of them, 3 women, all from my childhood, village. One had been my classmate, Fiona Murray. Another had been the organist at chapel, Katrina Bell. The third A girl named Isolde, who'd vanished one summer and never returned. She lives up in St. John's now, Arthur said. But she remembers him. He paused. All three of them. They weren't sure until they heard your story. They didn't know they weren't the only ones. I felt dizzy, not from pain, but from recognition. The monster I'd tried to hide. He'd left footprints on other lives. We decided to meet. My cottage was small but warm. I baked an apple cake and set out my mismatched enamel mugs. I lit a beeswax candle I'd been saving for no reason, its scent of honey and heather filling the air. One by one, they arrived. Fiona, with streaks of silver in her dark, tight curls, her hands that shook slightly. Katrina, still wearing small silver cross earrings, and Isolde, with her head held high and a look that said, "You will not break me again." We sat in a circle. No one spoke at first. Then Fiona said, "He used to volunteer at the school on Fridays, said he was helping with woodworking. He cornered me in the supply shed once." Katrina nodded slowly. "He offered to give me a ride home from choir practice. I thought he was just being kind, but he locked the doors." Isolde just whispered, "I ran. That was the only thing I did right. I ran." And then they looked at me. I didn't have to explain. They already knew. I said 4 words I'd waited 60 years to say. "You're not alone anymore." We cried. Not the loud kind, not the messy kind, just quiet tears that felt more like release than sorrow. It was like exhaling for the first time after holding your breath for a lifetime. That night, as they left, each woman hugged me tightly, not out of pity, but out of power. We had found each other in the ruins, and together, we were starting to build something that looked like justice. Arthur stayed behind to help me wash the mugs. As he dried the last one, he said softly, "I spent decades thinking I failed those girls." "You didn't fail us," I said. "The world did." He looked at me for a long time, then nodded. "But the world just got warned. They said it couldn't happen, that no one would take an 86-year-old man to trial for crimes committed over half a century ago. But they were wrong. With Arthur's help and the testimonies of Fiona, Katrina, and Isolde, we petitioned the Crown Prosecutor. The evidence wasn't pristine, but it was enough. Stories, old notes, and one survivor willing to speak under oath. The court date was set for October. It was raw that year, a Seacliff Coast autumn, where the sky feels heavy and the wind bites. I wore navy blue on the first day, not black. I wasn't mourning, I was testifying. Silas sat at the defense table, in a wheelchair. His hair was sparse, his skin pale like dried kelp. But his eyes, they were exactly the same, cold, calculating, like he still believed he commanded the lighthouse, and all within its beam. The prosecutor began with facts, timelines, documents. Then came the witnesses. Fiona cried on the stand. Katrina's voice shook. Isolde never broke eye contact with him. And then it was my turn. I stood. My knees didn't tremble. My voice didn't falter. I looked straight ahead and told them everything. The bolted door, the threats, the slap in the main room, the cellar, the years of silence. When I said he told me no one would ever believe me, I watched the jury lean in. But the real moment, the one I'll never forget, was when the prosecutor asked, "Why now? Why after all these years?" And I answered, "Because justice doesn't decay with time. It waits, and it remembers." The courtroom was silent, not out of politeness, but out of reckoning. Silas's lawyer tried to paint me as confused, attention-seeking, vengeful. But the jury didn't buy it. 12 people saw through his age and his cane and his somber suit. They saw what he really was, a man who thought time could bury truth. They couldn't. After 3 days of testimony and 2 hours of deliberation, the verdict was read: guilty on 5 counts of aggravated assault and unlawful confinement. The judge looked at him and said, "Your age is not a shield. Your past does not excuse your past." Then he sentenced him to 12 years in prison. It wouldn't be a long stay, but it would be his last. As they wheeled him out of the courtroom, he turned his head. For a moment, I thought he might speak, apologize. But he didn't. He just looked at me. And for once, I wasn't afraid. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I just met his gaze and nodded. Not in forgiveness, but in finality. Because the door he locked behind me all those years ago, I had just slammed shut on him. St. Brendan's Chapel stood at the crossroads where the village met the moor, its stone steeple weathered by wind and time, where the old women still wore headscarves to Sunday service. It hadn't changed much in 60 years. Still had the same plain wooden pews, still smelled of beeswax and damp wool, still had the memorial board by the entrance. The anchor roll, they called it. A polished piece of driftwood listing the names of significant contributors and steadfast members of the flock. Silas Blackwood's name had been there since 1964, near the top, carved deep and clear, seemingly eternal. Until now. 2 weeks after the verdict, I got a call from Reverend Wallace. He'd only been leading the chapel a few years. A younger man, direct, the kind who wore sturdy boots beneath his cassock and spoke of scripture with a quiet conviction. He said, "Miss Alara, I'd like to invite you to service this Sunday." I hadn't stepped foot inside that chapel since I was a girl in mended stockings and with a bruised spirit. Part of me wanted to say no, but another part, the part that had survived Silas's silence and shame, said yes. So I went. I wore gray, tied my hair back simply, and sat in the last pew, unnoticed at first. The sermon was about truth, about bringing what's hidden in darkness into the light, about justice not just as a heavenly ideal, but as a community's duty. At the end, Reverend Wallace cleared his throat. "We have one more matter today," he said. He walked over to the anchor roll. "I want to acknowledge that for years, this chapel unknowingly honored a man who caused great harm. We can't erase what he did, but we can remove his name." He took out a small chisel and mallet, and in front of the entire congregation, he carefully chipped away the wood bearing the name Silas Blackwood. The fragments fell silently onto a cloth he'd placed below. The silence in the room was thick, not with shock, but with a solemn understanding, the sound of a wound beginning to heal. He stepped down and walked straight to me, holding out a small, rough-hewn piece of wood with part of a letter carved on it. "You can keep this," he said softly, "or cast it into the sea. Either way, his name is no longer on our roll." I looked at the fragment. The carving was deep, meant to last. But I knew better. I stood, walked slowly to the chapel door, and out to the cliff edge. I tossed the wood into the wind, and it spun away towards the gray, churning water. When I came back in, the service was over. People were milling about, murmuring. One young woman approached me. Couldn't have been more than 22, with long, dark hair and anxious eyes. She said, "Ma'am, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry." I blinked. "For what?" "That no one believed you," she said. "That it took this long." Her voice cracked. "My aunt. She had someone like that. But she never talked. You did." I didn't know what to say, so I touched her hand. "Thank you," I whispered. She walked away, wiping her eyes. I turned back to the anchor roll. Where his name had been, there was now just smooth, blank wood. No scars, no scratches, just absence. But I didn't feel empty. I felt clean. Some people think healing is loud, explosive, cinematic. But sometimes it's quiet. It's a name removed, a stranger's apology, a moment where you finally look at something that once hurt, and it doesn't anymore. I left the chapel without looking back, because the past didn't live there anymore. These days, Sunday is my favorite day of the week. Not because of chapel, not anymore. I haven't gone back since they removed Silas's name. That was closure enough. But because of Arthur. Every Sunday morning he pulls up in front of my cottage in his old rattling blue lorry. It runs a little loud and smells faintly of diesel and salt, but he keeps it spotless. Like him. A bit rough on the outside, careful underneath. He honks twice. I always wait until the second one. Old habits. Let a man wait a little if he's worth it. I open the door, step down from the small porch, and he opens the passenger door like it's 1953, and I'm the May Queen. "Morning, Alara," he says. "Morning, Harbor Master." He chuckles every time. Haven't held that title in 20 years. "You still carry it in your posture," I say. We drive out to a cafe on the coast road. The Gull's Nest. Formica tables, strong tea, the best fish cakes in the county. The waitress knows our order before we sit. He gets an extra rasher of bacon. I get marmalade, not jam. We talk about small things. The tides, the neighbor's cat that had kittens, who died last week, who still hasn't. Sometimes we don't talk. At all. Just eat and sit in the quiet. The good kind, not the kind I grew up with. After breakfast, we go to the care home in the next village. There's a woman there named Iris, who loves to hum old tunes, even though she can't remember her own name. Arthur says hello to everyone like they're old shipmates. I bring a small tin of barley sugars. The nurses call me Miss Alara. I don't correct them. Arthur volunteers once a week, mending things that don't always need mending, just so the residents feel seen. And I just sit with them, listen to stories that wander and loop and sometimes make no sense at all. But they're told like they matter. That's what counts. One Sunday, while we were walking out to the lorry, he stopped suddenly. I turned. "Everything all right?" He looked at me, really looked, and said, "I never believed in angels." I raised an eyebrow. "You think I float when you're not looking?" He smiled. "No, but I do think God sends people to remind us what's worth standing up for. And Alara, that's you." I didn't cry. I haven't, not since the trial. But something deep in me softened, like a tangled fishing line finally coming free. "I was just trying to survive," I said. "And look what you did," he replied. "You outlived the darkness. You opened the door for others. That's not surviving, Alara. That's leading." He drives me home before noon. Always says, "See you next Sunday," like a promise. And I always answer, "You better." I sit on my porch after he leaves, sip tea, watch the sun climb over the sea cliff horizon, slow and warm, like an apology. People think justice means sirens and courtrooms, and sometimes it does, but sometimes it looks like this: a quiet porch, a clean conscience, a name removed, a plate of fish cakes, and someone who listens. I'm 78. I don't know how many Sundays I have left. But I do know this. He said he'd break me, but I broke the silence. First. And silence once broken never returns the same. If you've ever been hurt, and no one believed you, I'm here to say, I believe you. They don't tell you what comes after justice. They tell you to survive, to hold on, to endure until the verdict comes, until the truth is heard, until the weight is lifted. And when it finally is, you expect fanfares, a parade, some great thunderous relief. But what you get is a quiet mourning. And sometimes that's even better. The years after Silas's sentencing passed gently. He only lasted 3 more in prison before his body gave out. No grand funeral, no lengthy obituary, just a line in the county records. And for the first time in my life, the world didn't bend around his name. I didn't feel joy when I read it. I didn't feel hate either, just closure, like a book with no more pages. But that wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one I never thought I'd have. Arthur and I grew closer in those next few years. What started as Sunday breakfast turned into Tuesday teas, then Friday market trips, then Thursday evening porch sits where we didn't even pretend we had somewhere else to be. He never pushed, never pried. He just showed up. There was one evening, late summer, when the sky turned a fiery orange too early, and the air smelled like rain that never quite arrived. I was sitting on the porch swing, shelling peas into an old enamel bowl when he walked up, holding a jar of wild blueberry jam. "Got these at the village fair," he said. "They were 2 for $1. I grinned. "And you couldn't possibly eat both." He sat beside me. "I could, but it's better with company." We talked about nothing for an hour. The rust on the neighbor's gate, the seagull that stole Mrs. Henderson's washing. And then, somewhere between silence and small talk, he reached over and held my hand. Not like a man trying to win something, but like someone who'd already won, just by being allowed in. "You know," he said, his voice quiet, "I used to think love was for the young, for those who hadn't been broken yet." I looked at him. "And now?" I asked. "Now I think love is for those who've survived it all and still choose to sit beside someone, just like this." We didn't speak after that. Didn't need to. The swing creaked gently beneath us. The sky turned to deep indigo, and I realized for the first time in my life, I felt safe. Our routine changed after that. He started keeping a spare razor at my cottage. I made room for his old tweed jacket in the narrow hall cupboard. We didn't call it anything. Not courting, not partners, just us. My neighbors started calling him "your gentleman friend," and I didn't correct them. He brought me wildflowers once, purple sea asters, because they don't try too hard. I made his favorite apple crumble and pretended it was the last of the apples, just to watch him protest. Sometimes we sat in complete silence, the kind that didn't ask for conversation, just presence. Once on a Tuesday, he kissed my temple and said, "Elara, if I'd met you 50 years ago, I would have married you." I smiled and said, "If you'd met me 50 years ago, I wouldn't have let you pass the garden gate." He laughed. "Fair enough." Life didn't become perfect. It became real. I still had bad dreams sometimes. Still jolted awake at sounds I couldn't name. Still found myself looking over my shoulder when a man walked too close behind me. But now, when I woke up trembling, there was a warm hand reaching for mine in the dark. "Just me," Arthur would whisper. "You're safe." And I was. One autumn, the local school invited me to speak at their Coastal Voices series. I almost said no. What did I know about having a voice? But Arthur looked me in the eye and said, "Elara, you didn't just survive. You turned your pain into a beacon. And that kind of light doesn't belong under a bushel." So I went. I stood in front of 50 teenage girls and told them what no one told me when I was their age, that they mattered, that silence doesn't mean safety, that believing someone can be the difference between breaking and becoming. Afterward, a girl hugged me and whispered, "You made me feel seen." And that's when I knew. I hadn't just survived for myself. I'd survived for her, for all of them. The little herb garden out back bloomed brighter that year. Arthur built me a bench from driftwood, with our initials carved underneath. We started having neighbors over for tea, and stories that made us laugh till our sides hurt. I told my story again, on the local radio, in the community newspaper, even in a little recording someone's grandson made for his Stories of the Sea project. Not because I liked remembering, but because I refused to let forgetting win. One morning, on my 80th birthday, Arthur brought me breakfast in bed. Slightly burnt toast, perfectly poached eggs, and tea just the way I liked it. "Perfect," I said. He sat beside me, holding my hand in that same quiet way. "You know," he said, "if heaven has porches, I hope they look just like this one." I smiled. "With you in the rocking chair beside me. Always. I don't know how much longer I have. None of us do. But I know this. He said no one would ever believe me, but someone did. And that belief changed everything. It gave me a life I didn't dare dream of. A life with strong tea and laughter and slow mornings. A life where my name means more than my past. A life where I'm no longer just a story of pain, but proof of what comes after. Healing, love, peace. Every day I sit on my porch and watch the sun rise over the Seacliff coast, and every day I whisper to the wind, "You were wrong, Silas. I wasn't not. I was just waiting to become something more." This has been a story from Echoes from the Coast, where we voice the unvoiced, because truth has no tide line, and every soul has a story worth telling.